Welcome back. We have another video for you today, and I hope that you're doing fantastic. So in this video, we're going to be talking about how the phaser works, phasing versus flanging. And at the beginning, the first half, it's going to be very technical. And so what I'm talking about could apply in any kind of digital audio workstation, really just with phasing in general. It's the underlying concepts and underlying principles that are useful to know inside of a program like Bitwig Studio, because as you'll see, we can apply those concepts beyond the phaser. We can actually create our own and do variations on it, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And then in the second half of the video, we'll go specific with this phaser, and we'll spend some time, mostly I think focused on these L and R controls, because that's the only thing that's unique about this phaser compared to anything else that you're going to pick up or see, or at least for me, this is the unique kind of interesting part of this phaser that you don't see in other places. To start, you can see that I've really pulled back on this phaser. I got rid of the LFO, which traditionally you will have an LFO controlling frequency. That's what gives you that phasing effect. There is a movement component to this. Feedback is set to 0, not using the high pass filter, mix all the way up, down to 2-pole. And what we'll see is that once we play this back over this white noise, what we've created is really like a notch at the 1K value. If I go in here and I bring in a third pole, you'll see that that notch location changes, and it looks like we start to create almost like another low pass, right? Go from 2, and it's actually more easily seen in the phaser itself, up to 3. When I go to 4, it's now like we've created 2 notch filters. But typically you would only need to use, right, 2 EQ bands, and instead we've had to use 4 to create this. And so what this means is that the phaser is when you're adding poles, you're really adding in filters, but every time you get to an even number, you've created a pair and you've created a set of all pass filters. So from 4 to 6, we should expect to see 3 spikes, and we do, and it will continue on and on and on like that. And that's why you can't go to 1. 1 pole would just be like a low pass filter. Okay, and if you don't believe me, I'm going to show you this with EQs in just a second. But quickly on the all pass filter, with 2 pole here, we've created an all pass filter, and it's happening at 1K. It's happening at the frequency we set. If we put this down to 500, we can see that it moves down to 500. If we were to put it to 2K, it would move to 2K and so forth. Now, what we've done is we've created a single all-pass filter at, and I want to go back to the 1K point. The all-pass filter, it's exactly what it sounds like. In theory, all of the frequencies are supposed to be passing through. So why have we created this notch here? Well, we've created a phase issue at that point. And now this is where we have to jump into the EQ and talk about, the technical specs on EQ, how it's working, and how we can create this same sort of effect. Let's talk a little bit about the technical nature of EQ. Every time we bring in some kind of a band, whether that be a bell or whether it's a filter, in order for the EQ to do its job, a little bit of a phase shift has to occur in order for the timing of this to be possible, right? Like doing this in real time is very difficult. So a very small phase shift occurs to the signal, and then it's able to apply whatever sort of filtering or any kind of like band adjustments that you want to make. Some people will caution you about using too many EQs on a source because it can cause phase problems. In most situations, it's not going to be an issue. It's not going to be perceptible. It's not going to matter. But one place where it will matter and where you'll really start to see and hear a problem is when you create the all-pass type filter. All right, so what I've done here is we have a low pass 12 set at 1K. And then in the other EQ, we have a high pass 12 set at 1K. So these are basically identical. And if you think about it, because this is a split signal, it's like a parallel configuration, it should sound identical, right? We shouldn't be hearing any kind of change. However, when we look at this, we'll see that that's not the case. We'll see and hear it. All right, here we go. Oh, we bring it in, and that's the phase issue. That's what's causing that notch. So it's not just a single bell taking that out. It's actually those points overlapping. Now, where is this an issue? If you're creating your own multiband type effect, you need to be very careful with this. because if you set them up identical at that cutoff point or at that crossover frequency, that's where you're going to have a problem. And so you need to like slightly offset that. And that's why when you look at the multibands, and they now will show you in Bitwig how that's working and how kind of broad those crossover points are, that's designed so that this sort of a thing doesn't happen. So that if you turn it on and off, you're not going to hear a problem. And in fact, we can bring on like the multiband too, and we'll notice that we don't have that issue. So you can see here with the multiband FX3 and also with the multiband FX2 that we don't have this kind of a problem. And you can see just how broad these crossover points are. With the multiband FX2, we don't actually get any visual feedback, but again, you can see we're not having that issue. And so if you are doing any kind of like multiband processing in Bitwig, do it this way. Don't do it this FX layer style setup, because you will create that phase problem. So that's like a little bit of an insider tip. And I hate to use words like that, but it really is to be aware of that. Because sometimes I used to set it up like this, and it would cause, or it will cause, these problems. So just kind of an FYI to be aware of. One thing that is really neat is that with your traditional phaser, what you're doing here is you're swinging this point around. And that's what's creating that tearing, that's what's creating that ripping that we associate with the phaser. Is that something that we can actually create on our own using EQs inside of Bitwig? And the answer is yes, we can, and I'll show you that application. So using the EQ5 and taking advantage of the shift control, we can create the exact same thing, the equivalent of this frequency knob in here. And you can see that I have, our 1K set up here with our high pass, and then our 1K with our low pass, and then the shift is set to 40. It's set identical on both of these guys. You can see that here. And now this is really corresponding to frequency, and I can do the same thing. And if we listen to what we have in the phaser, it's identical. So one thing that is going to be different, and one thing to maybe, experiment with, is you can now, using the EQ5, if you put in multiple versions of these, you could create the 4-pole, 6-pole, 8-pole. You could even do like 3-pole if you really wanted to. We would just have to put in like a low pass filter and again apply that to the shift. But you can set the frequencies that you want. Okay, that is not something that you can do with the phaser. You can't choose what sort of frequencies that you want to have. That's just based on how it's working and based on the number of like poles that you're bringing in. Feedback is also something that isn't going to like really operate the same way. Okay, so with feedback here, with 2 poles anyway, what it's really doing is it is just feeding the signal back on itself, and it should make it like more resonant. But it really depends on your pole settings. So like with 2-pole, if I increase the feedback, you can see it starts to create a peak up in here in like the 5K range. If I go down the other way, it creates more of a resonant peak just below that 1K point. So exactly how that's working and how that's determined, I really don't know. But one thing I do know is that you can get some interesting variation with our sort of like makeshift phaser by going in and having another macro control adjust this value here, okay, the slope amount. And so you can really then set the resonance at that point, which I think is kind of cool and actually very usable. So if I go in here again and I create the macro, and again, I'm not really, this is so theoretical here, but with certain signals, this might be kind of an interesting thing if you know exactly the frequency, like if it's a fundamental that you want to emphasize, or like the 2nd or 3rd or 4th harmonic, you could actually very easily do that with this setup, which you can't do with like the traditional phaser. So I would just go in here and let's just set it to like a value of 1. We don't have to go too crazy. Let's go 1.5. Okay, so we'll do that there. And we need to make sure we set it identical here. And now we'll listen, have this one turned off. interesting. So sort of like the resonator bank. And that's maybe what it is that we're really emulating in here more so than the phaser. But I just wanted to show you how with EQ and with like the natural inherent phase shifts that apply through that process, that you can get the exact same sort of effect that you have with the phaser. One thing that may be of interest to some of you is that if you bring in certain plugins, like this is an emulation of an analog passive design with the filters. And you can see that we have the same sort of thing set up. We have one that has a high pass set to 2K, and the other has the low pass set to 2K. So in theory, we'd be thinking, uh-oh, we're going to have that phase problem. But you'll notice that in this example, we actually don't. And let's just go back and we'll play signal. And now we'll bring it in. If anything, it almost just sounds like the top end is like boosting a little bit, and that must have to do with the design of these filters, and you can see that there is a slight change up there. If anything, this maybe is actually just giving your signal a little bit more weight. So this would work as an alternative to maybe using Bitwig's multiband FX2. Maybe you use like analog filters as sort of your basis. So that's just an idea, something worth explaining. And the final thing I want to show you is what happens with like linear phase EQs or minimum phase EQs and how you can get a lot of variation. So now we have an example with an EQ that for many people is kind of like the holy grails of EQs, FabFilter's Pro Q2. And you can see that we have the exact same setup here, a low pass and a high pass filter, both at 1K, identical settings, creating our all pass filter. And we'll see that again, we do have a little bit of a dip occurring. And we can hear that like so. But then the other thing we can do is we can go in here and try natural phase for both. And that creates something more akin to what we saw with the EQs inside of Bitwig and those filters. And then the last thing we have is linear phase. So you would think with linear phase, when we go on and off, that shouldn't cause any sort of change in the sound. But interestingly, it will, and it does, especially depending on the mode you set here. So we'll begin with medium. And with medium, it looks pretty good. But we do hear a sonic difference. And I really don't. Uh-oh. My apologies, guys. Didn't expect that to happen. That's why you just don't mess with something when it's playing back. I just wanted to turn the analyzer off. But now we do have our examples with linear phase set to medium. And I want to really listen for a difference. The one thing that is being introduced here, though, with the linear phase is that we're going to see, if I can bring this up, we're going to see a decent amount of latency being brought in, and the higher we go here on the settings, the more latency. All right, so that's how it's able to kind of compensate through what one article calls like trickery, is that we have to introduce quite a bit of phase into this signal path. And so let's go through and let's again try out maybe the highest setting, or we'll just go to very high in this example. You can see just how much that gets introduced and how long it takes after I hit play. But we can listen, and again, there's definitely a difference. One more time. So you now understand the basics of how a phaser works more than you probably ever wanted to. But what I did want to do is kind of go through here and show you some interesting quirks about the poles and when you bring them in. So the phaser is not really like an harmonic effect. You bring in more poles where those pop up. I'm sure it's determined by some kind of formula, but I actually have zero clue how that's determined. And so when we go up through our pole values here, remember that we're starting at 1K. If I start to go up here, we can see them shifting around into different places. Here we are at 4. This is happening like at 2.3. So like, is there any sort of relationship to the 1K? It doesn't really seem like it. As we go up, we can see that when we hit 6, we actually do see that one of our all-pass filters comes back in at 1K. And so this is just kind of useful to know depending on how much movement you're doing. Because remember, what really makes the phaser is the tearing effect of moving this around. But if you were to use the phaser as a static effect, especially taking advantage of these L&R controls that we'll get to a little bit later on, and maybe just like a touch of feedback, right, one way or the other, a feedback setting where it's not adjusting where our kind of spikes are popping up, this could be very beneficial for you and something to be aware of. So let's keep going up here, and let's see when the next time is that it's going to hit 1K. It does it at 10, so 6 to 10, both of those, and also 2. So right now we're going based on +4. We go up a little bit further. Okay, 14, it happens again. So we can expect that at 18, we'll see the same thing. We do. At 22, I believe it should also hit. And then also like at 26, it does. And at like 30, and so forth. So for some reason, as you go up and you start to add 2s to your number of poles, or excuse me, you add 4 to the number of pole values, it then corresponds and lines back up with the frequency you set. I'm sure there's like a mathematical reason for that, a formula reason for it, but I have no idea why that is. Maybe somebody can help me out down in the comments section below. All right, so the last thing that really makes this a phaser is, let's just go up to one of those values. Let's go with 14, is that you have an LFO that controls the frequency. So we can bring in set LFO here. Let's go with what they give you, which is the classic LFO. And then you just have to go on here and you set your depth. How far do you want it? That's probably a little bit too crazy. We'll go into this sort of a range right here, and then we can listen to the effect that it has on the sound. So if we slow it down, we can see as we go higher, those spikes become more prominent, at least visually to us. And as they go lower, not so much. Let's use 18. So as you hear at the higher frequencies, it makes quite a bit greater of a difference on the sound. And this is part of the reason why we have this low skip frequency. This is just like a sidechain filter. And so we can set this up so that the phasing is really only going to be occurring to frequencies like 466 hertz and up. So if we set this frequency to be very low, let's actually slow it down here. I'm going to make it really extreme. And so it's really interesting, you know, the number of poles you set can really drastically impact the final sound of this. That's getting a pretty nice sound out of it. To the point where it's not even moving, so let's do it this way. So now you can hear down here, nothing's happening. And that's really all there is to there with the phaser effect. One thing that is worth highlighting is that when this comes up by default and it is set to be synced to the beat, if we go to like 4, for example, watch and see what happens when we re-trigger the start of this. This is set in bipolar mode. It starts it over. So if you don't want that to occur and you want it to be free running, just turn note trigger on and then it will let it go through the full iteration. So that's something that I noticed that I think would be useful to some of you if you had this like, looping over and over again, that it would re-trigger, and that may not be something that you want. There are actually a lot of differences between phasing and flanging, and so we'll just go through a few of them here. We'll begin with the mix knob. You'll notice that with the phaser, as I go and get more and more wet, we hear more of the effect. Okay, so if I start at 0 and go up to 100, at 100 is where we really get the full-blown effect here. If I go into the flanger, and remember, this has to do with feedback being set to off, and I go and I do the same kind of thing, we'll hear that at 50% is where we get the most of the effect, and then at 100%, it kind of goes away again. And so you might be wondering, well, why is that? Well, the flange effect is actually a delay-based effect. So when you bring in a flanger, what you're really doing is creating like a parallel signal flow with the mix knob setting the amount of that second delay. So you have the original and you have the delayed version. The mix is setting how much of that delayed version is coming in. So at 50%, that's where you actually get 50% original, 50% delay. And with a really, really short delay time, that's where you're getting that phase differential, is it's that ever so slight delay, and that 50% is where it's making the biggest difference. When you go to 100, you're getting all of that flange, so you're just getting later time. When you introduce feedback, not as true. You can be at 100% on the mix, and you'll start to hear kind of a big difference with the sound, but that's kind of the general idea. With the phaser, that's not going on. The phaser is not another delay line. It's not a delay line. It's just literally altering, by using all pass filters, it is altering the phase of the signal supposedly like in real time, or more so in real time than what you have with the flanger, which is a delay line. The second big difference has to do with where our kind of notches are occurring, where our phase points are happening in the spectrum. You'll see that with the phaser, we have this set to 1K. We have it at 22 poles so that we will get a notch at the 1K point. As I go to these additional notches, this is at 1K. This is like 1.3. This is like 1.8. This is like 2.6. This is like 4.38. This is like 11. There's not really a logic to it. And as we move that frequency around, we'll see that there really isn't a logic to these guys. The same thing cannot be said about the flanger. Okay, when we bring the flanger in and we apply a bit of feedback here, you can see that, that's them together. You can see that I'm getting a spike at 1K. As I go up, we're actually going to be following the harmonic series. So it's going to be 1K, 2K, 3K, 4K, 5K, upwards and onwards going through like so. And this is why the flanger sounds like such a less aggressive effect. Like on a guitar, for example, the phaser can really kind of smack you. It sounds like it's coming out of left field. And that's because these harmonic points, these sort of phase moments where the signal is being cut out, or you're getting that effect, it's not really related to the harmonic series. Whereas with the flanger, it is. And so one is more of a harmonic effect, whereas the other is a little bit more, I don't want to say dissonant. Well, it even is dissonant, but it's a lot more random, especially then when you start to add in the movement with those LFOs. So I would say those are your really major differences between the phaser and the flanger, and feedback also responds quite a bit differently. Also, you'll be able to see that in the spectrum, but that's actually something better heard on something like a guitar or a human voice, a mono signal. Bring it in, mess around with the feedback, and you'll be able to hear even some more differences between the flanger and the phaser. So last but not least, let's talk about what makes this phaser very unique. And what makes it unique is that we have control over the left and right channels independently. So for starters, this is what can take your mono signal and get it into a stereo signal. So you can go mono to stereo once you start offsetting the frequency point, and you can see that this is operating in steps, not in hertz. So what does that really mean? Well, we can see here with our analyzer set up to be operating in stereo, that if we're put in here at 1K, right, we have our 2-pole, we can see that's where our notch is occurring. If I go in here to the left, and I say 12, what that means is, on the left, we've created, in essence, another all-pass filter, this one happening following a harmonic series. So this is 1K, 12 is an octave. We should expect a doubling, and that's exactly what we see with this at 2K. And now as I move the frequency, it's going to go along accordingly. So if I put this in now at 500, we can see how those are moving together. And so this has a lot of potential, okay? I can go into the right side, and let's say in this case, I'm gonna put this to be -12. What do we expect to have happen? Well, now on the right side, our notch is occurring at 500. And now we have a very stereo effect. We could add more poles. So keep in mind that this isn't really like changing the signal. It's not like when I go +12 that on one side it's going to sound, you know, as if it's a pitch shifter. This is really determining where those points are happening on the all pass. So actually, as you can hear in this example, if we were to isolate the left and the right sides, the right side should actually sound brighter because where it's taking away on the right is actually down here at 500. And so on the right, it's quite a bit, you know, brighter, or it should sound quite a bit brighter. And then on the left, it should be a little bit darker. All right. So that's really kind of the basis there. And you can really hear that too. And I'll pause it for a second and bring in a plugin that will really allow us to highlight this. So this Hofa meter will quickly allow us to hear the difference. So if I take the left and I put that down to 0 and we're only hearing the right side, okay, we can hear how bright it sounds. If I bring that up to 0 and trim the other one down so that we're only hearing the left, we can hear how much darker that sounds in comparison. So you might be wondering, what are actually some practical applications of this? And there's actually a lot. So for starters, we can go mono to stereo here on something like a vocal just by offsetting either of these. But this is really serving two functions. Not only is it taking in and making it stereo, but we can also then determine what side we want the brightness on. Right? Because if I take left and I swing that hard to the right, what we're really doing is we're causing that dip to occur higher up. So in the left side, it actually is going to sound darker, or you could do, you know, the vice versa here. And then where it really gets fun is when you kind of offset everything and then have LFOs operating on all three of these at kind of different rates and maybe in different directions. And so you could get kind of a really wild stereo effect that doesn't have to be like too aggressive. You could leave this at 2 poles without a lot of feedback, or you could make it very aggressive. So let's just go in here and maybe have a little bit of fun with that by bringing in LFOs. And I'm going to just bring LFOs in on all three. And we'll set them all up a little bit differently. That sounds like a great idea. All right, so I'll just probably speed the video up, and then when I get something cool, we'll jump back in.
Hey,
The last thing worth noting is that this phaser is useful not only going mono to stereo, but also if you already do have something in stereo and you want additional variation with what's happening on the left and on the right channel. So here's our example. Again, not something that you're ever probably going to encounter in the real world, but that's totally fine for the sake of example. If I go in here and I turn the phaser on, you'll notice that we are getting an effect happening to both the left and the right, but because I only have this LFO affecting what's going on the left, you're not going to hear movement to the right, but you will still hear the phasing effect. Right, you can hear how that guitar has got a lot quieter because of where that phase shift is happening. But if I go on and I add another LFO that's going to be moving slowly, all right, we'll make it move very slow. You can hear that's now happening to both the right and the left. So it's very interesting, the amount of variety that you are able to get out of this phaser. So that was a very, very long video. We probably talked about, or I should say, we went into much more depth than probably you ever wanted to. But I hope you're able to use some of this with your music and so that you can get some really diverse and interesting sounding effects using the phaser in conjunction with all the other stuff inside of this program. So just kind of a final parting word is that in Bitwig, I do believe having a really strong foundation of understanding the technical side of how these things are working versus just the sonic effects can take you very far. So for example, let's say that you have a guitar and you know the fundamental and you know the third or fourth overtone and you really want to hype those or do something interesting with them. You could go in and create those all pass filters at those specific points using the EQs and then, process those chains in different ways and really highlight that aspect of the sound. Not something you could do with the phaser, but now that you understand how it's done and how we can create something similar, I hope that you can really see the potential for this and even the greater potential that exists in the program in general. If you made it to the end, congratulations, and thanks for watching. Until next time, take it easy.